Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to you all. My name is Sudha David-Wilp, and on behalf of GMF, I'd like to welcome you to this week's coronavirus update from the United States. Today, we're discussing local responses to the pandemic and what we're learning in the process. And we're very grateful to have two great speakers with us today, Mayor Mitch Landrieu and Salin Geevarghese. Mitch Landrieu is a former mayor of the city of New Orleans and former lieutenant governor of the great state of Louisiana. When Mitch was sworn in as mayor of New Orleans in 2010, he inherited lots of crises. The city of New Orleans was still recovering from Hurricane Katrina and the BP oil spill, and he saw a great comeback story with the city of New Orleans. And he also experienced a challenge while he was mayor because he decided to take down 4 Confederate monuments in New Orleans, which earned him the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. Mitch, I read the book. It's a great book, recounts his personal journey confronting racism and tackles the broader history of race relations and institutional inequalities in the American South and in the larger United States. And he recently founded the initiative Pluribus Unum, which we will discuss later on in the conversation. I'd like to also introduce Salin Geevarghese. He is the president and CEO of SGG Insight, a consulting firm offering services to public, private, nonprofit, and philanthropic organizations. He also serves as senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy, as well as the founding director of the Mixed Income Strategic Alliance. From 2014 to 2017, Salin served in a senior appointed position in the Obama administration. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of International and Philanthropic Innovation at HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Agency. So I'm going to go first to Mayor Landrieu, and then we'll turn to Salin. I encourage all of you to send questions via the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. I will try to queue them up, and we'll get to them probably within the last 20 minutes of our conversation. Mitch, great to see you.
Hey, Sudha.
Nice to see you again. It's not as hot in Berlin today as like it was last year when you came to visit. We just talked about all the crises you confronted. How does this pandemic differ?
Well, there are myriads of crises that over history, if you read it, will have happened and will continue to happen. As you mentioned, when I took office, the city of New Orleans itself, which is right on the bottom of the country and right on the top of the Gulf and in an inauspicious place for massive hurricanes, suffers through a dramatic number of those, but Katrina was one of the biggest. So we had Katrina, we had Rita, we had Ike, we had Gustav. When we were weak, we then had the national recession, and then on top of that, we had the BP oil spill. All of those things created a cataclysmic set of circumstances that forced the city to almost go into bankruptcy, and then it had to completely rebuild itself from top to bottom. And all of those things bring tremendous challenges. When you are trying to respond to a challenge, the way it works best is when there is great command and control from the federal, state, and local governments, and that then helps you stand back up. If there's any light of day between you and the partners that you need help with, it gets a lot harder. Now, this pandemic is much, much bigger because it's so long and it's so deep. The scale and the breadth of it is worldwide. So we haven't really seen anything like this in a long time. Yesterday, unfortunately, we hit the 100,000 death mark in the United States of America. And of course, that number is exponentially higher worldwide. So this is the biggest biggest immediate threat that we have seen in the world as a collective body of people. And it's going to require that kind of response in order to protect each other over time.
And how come, cities have been unfortunately on the front line of this pandemic? Why have cities been affected so terribly?
Well, I'm not sure that that's completely accurate. I think when we first started, it was pretty clear that the city of New Orleans, the city that I'm in right now, and the city of New York both were on the front lines of this thing. But it was pretty clear to everybody who knew a little bit about infectious diseases that this particular virus was going to spread and was being spread, and was, quite frankly, was much more ubiquitous than the first series of reportings. As you may recall, people were like, oh, it's in New York and it's New Orleans. But now that we're looking back on it, all of the traces are telling us that it had been spewing throughout the country. On top of that, there's no wall, there's no boundary that's going to keep this virus from touching people in the rural areas as well. One of the reasons why you see more incidences and more deaths is because there are more people in the cities who are in closer proximity to each other. But my guess is that in the next couple of months, unfortunately, what you're going to see is a tremendous strain on the rural areas in America that don't have the kind of healthcare capacity that some cities have. And I think you're beginning to see that already.
Yeah, it's true. I think that at first, reading reports from here, it seemed like it was affecting just urban areas, but now it seems like the rural areas in the US are also being touched by it.
Right. Well, they're going to get touched. They're going to get touched by it. But let me. What else is going to happen is this pandemic, and the consequences are going to be with us for a very, very long period of time. One thing that catastrophic events do is they pull back the curtain on what is. In other words, those things that were more beautiful, become more beautiful and more rich. Weird kind of connectivity, notwithstanding the fact that we're socially distant, people are finding ways to really connect that they hadn't had before, or to be grateful for things that maybe they had walked by. And there are thousands of examples of that. But what it also does is peel back all of the fissures that existed in society. And of course, one of the things in the United States that this thing will reveal will be the inadequacy of the healthcare delivery infrastructure, not only in cities, but in rural areas as well. And the consequence is going to be, when this is over, much just like small businesses closing, rural hospitals will close by the droves. And there was already lack of access to healthcare, not only in rural areas, but in poor urban areas as well. And that is going to become one of the challenging long-term crises that has to be fixed sooner rather than later.
Yeah, very true. It's we've often talked in the context of elections, the rural-urban divide, but unfortunately, this is something that binds rural and urban areas in the United States. But nevertheless, Mayor Landrieu, I was reading an interesting article in the Financial Times by Simon Cooper about Paris and how it's been deserted. And, there seems to be a lot of articles about people taking a flight from urban areas. Also, New York City, people moving into the suburbs. They're looking for refuge, more space, perhaps a simpler way of life. But what do you think is going to beckon them back eventually? What is so great about cities that will eventually draw people back?
Well, those are two separate questions. What is great about cities, and then whether or not people are going to come back. I'll take the first. Cities have lately become the hubs of culture, creativity, and innovation. In the United States of America, in the 60s and 70s, they had something that they called white flight, where people left the cities in droves and went out to the suburban areas and into the rural areas. All of the demographic trends in the last couple of years indicated that had changed completely, and that people were coming back into cities, especially middle-aged folks whose kids were grown up and had gone off to do other things. And cities right now in the United States of America, not every city, but most cities, are becoming the hubs of innovation and creativity and art and music and culture, and people have been moving back. Now, of course, this pandemic hits, and the pandemic says you need to get away from everybody. So everybody is now trying to get away. My sense is that most people will come back. And my sense is, because this is where everybody's home is. After Katrina hit, as you may recall, the city was 17 feet underwater. People couldn't live here. And people from across America and across the world accepted our people. And I think everybody, if anybody's on the line that did anything. And eventually, most of those individuals came back. Some of them stayed. And when you ask them what drove their decision, it was really economic. They said, I went where I could make a living. If I couldn't make a living in New Orleans, I didn't go back. If I could make a living in Houston or Atlanta, or I found a better school for my kids, I stayed. But most people said I came back because I had to, and because I loved the place where I was, because there's a deep connection that most of us get to a particular place in our life. And one of the things that makes New Orleans a little bit unique, it's not unlike the rest of the country, but it is a little bit different, is people are really, really tied to the history of New Orleans. I surmise that that is probably true about a lot of people. So it's hard for them to leave. And my sense is that all things being equal, should it be safe, my guess is the strong impetus will be to go back what people consider home, which is where your family and your friends are.
Mhm. And I mean, I don't want to paint a dark picture. I mean, I would hope that cities will be able to attract those of us that like to go to cafes and, like you said, be close to people and, you know, offer creative spaces. But what about the budget shortfalls that many cities are facing all across the United States and, you know, states? It's going to be a hard time getting back up again.
Oh, I think there's no question about it. But you know, the same thing's going to be true about rural areas, and it's actually going to be worse. And this is one of the things that in the United States Congress has to pay attention to. For some reason, in the last couple of years, Congress has started treating cities, municipalities, counties, and states like they're special interests, like it's the banking industry or the airline industry. Of course, we're not. We're partners in delivering essential services. Number one. Number two, all of the people that are working on the front lines, the policemen, the firemen, the folks that are driving the taxis, the buses, individuals that are working in the stores, many of them are public city and or state employees. And if the cities and states don't have what it is that they need to do their work, the virus is going to get worse. More people are going to die. And so I think it's really important as Congress, as they are right now, are thinking about how to help stand up the economy, that they make sure they do that with their partners on the local level. Every mayor in America, and by the way, there are 1,400 of them that run cities that are 30,000 or more, and then there's a larger number that represent a lot of the smaller ones, are on the street every day trying to make sure that the city is running. And I think people take for granted a lot in cities, even if you work in a city and you work for the federal government or you work for a private, that somebody's getting that water to and from your house, somebody's turning the lights on, somebody's picking the garbage up, somebody's making sure that the buses and the trains and the streetcars are running on time. All of those things have to continue to function if the economy is going to continue to try to even get back on its feet. So I would argue very strongly with my friends in Washington, D.C., that they have to make sure that states and cities are not in a position of being financially strained more than they normally would be. And finally, let me just say this. This is a deep hole. When I took office, we had to cut about 22% out of our budget, which is a gargantuan amount of money. It's not easy. It requires a lot of sacrifice. It has to be done very smartly, wisely, and more so with a scalpel, not with a hatchet. And then eventually, if you're thoughtful about the decisions that you make, you can grow your entity back in a thoughtful and a reasonable way. But it won't be without great sacrifice.
You mentioned how the pandemic has sort of cast, unfortunately, a negative light on some of the weaknesses in our society. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your work, your new initiative, Pluribus Unum. Tell us a little bit about it, and you know, how is the mission significant, especially today in light of this pandemic?
Well, as you mentioned early in my introduction, and I thank you for it, it was very kind. I served 30 years in public office in the Deep South in the United States of America. And I can't remember an issue that I dealt with that didn't have race somewhere lurking right beneath the surface. And it's been my belief and the work of my family that the United States has never really fully realized the aspiration of the creed that all of us are created equal and that there's equal opportunity. It's patently clear to anybody in the United States that if all of us don't come to the table of democracy as equals, then many of us get left behind, and we never will be as good as we profess that we want to be. And of course, it couldn't be more compelling than just the events of this last week in the United States of America, when we had 4 very visible racial incidents that, you know, have kind of peeled back the difficulty that we're having. And that's on top of the stark evidence that COVID, even though it doesn't discriminate racially, has a negative and a higher negative impact, disproportionate impact on people of color who have underlying illnesses that are a result of the conditions that they live in and their access to healthcare. And so the United States really just can't turn away from this. Now, this is not unique to the United States of America. This sense of white supremacy, nationalism is really kind of moving around the world in a very dangerous way right now. And of course, each country has a very sordid past in treating other people who they think are less than differently from people who are running the country. And so the issue of race is just one that humankind has to deal with. In the United States, we have a particular problem with it that stems from, in my opinion, our history of slavery, Jim Crow laws, et cetera, et cetera. And we have got to get past that so that every American citizen, enjoys their rights that are duly given to them by the Constitution. That's the only way the country is going to get where we aspire to be, which is out of many we are one, which is, of course, the name of our organization, Pluribus Unum.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mayor Landrieu. I mean,
Sure.
It's so true. Unfortunately, this pandemic has had us sort of fall back into nationalist positions, but the way we're going to probably solve this is through cooperation and more multilateralism. Salin, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, feel free to weigh in on what Mayor Landrieu talked about how unfortunately this pandemic has disproportionately affected people of color in the United States. And I'm sure that's true for other places, but also just even poor people in general have taken the brunt of this pandemic. And when you think about cities, will this pandemic perhaps offer an opportunity to reshape things where we don't have such a stark divide in cities between high income earners and working class people? You're on mute.
That happens.
Okay.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with you, our colleagues around the world who are tuning in, and then it's an honor and a tough act to follow Mayor Landrieu. There was a little bit of a ditto sensibility that came over me as he was speaking, and the vigorous nods of heads. What I would put on the table is this, and even in the founding of Pluribus Unum, as Mayor Landrieu actually put on the table, that our social and economic collapses, both domestically and here in the United States and around the world, I think always lay bare, as Mayor Landrieu actually said, who is living on the margins. It gets that much clearer. There are different instigators, different perpetrators of what contributes to the collapse, whether it's a pandemic or, as Mayor Landrieu just speaking about, the kind of stain of racism here in the United States and xenophobia around the world. But the disproportionality of the impact is the same. The most vulnerable suffer the most. And I think of it in a couple of ways that I think are probably going to animate our conversation today, but in particular, a set of tough conditions and context from my vantage point that underlie this that I think we're going to have to confront, which is a sense of zero-sum mentality and divisiveness, that there have to be winners and losers, perverse incentives, whether from policy or program, of rewarding work, but as we find now, work that doesn't pay enough, people not being able to get by. And we see that was the other announcement today that is hitting the news about the additional unemployment claims, and over 40 million Americans who filed for unemployment over the last number of weeks. I think fear and scarcity and constraint that saw itself in images and stories of these last number of weeks of people trying to get the most for themselves and to protect their benefit at all cost. And to the point that Mayor Landrieu was mentioning around the daylight, the need to not have daylight across the governance sphere from federal to state to local. We also see when there is daylight, particularly in a national emergency where federal leadership and coordination would help contain costs, allay fears, when that's not present, how the fissures get exacerbated. And we saw these stories, and Mayor Landrieu and his colleagues around the country, whether mayors or governors alike, actually speaking to cities and states in incomprehensible ways, trying to compete against themselves for PPE, when that can't be the way we kind of come together. So I think there's some underlying things. I know we'll get into some other topics around what gets laid bare, and I'm grateful for the courage and conviction of Mayor Landrieu and others, and even this conversation that says we've got to take very specific actions that enable us to address both what has always existed as underlying and those that are actually much more pressing today.
Great. We'll definitely get into some questions regarding more coordination between local and federal authorities. And I noticed that some questions are coming in. I encourage all of you to send more questions to the Q&A function. But tell us, Salin, besides, this pandemic and perhaps other public health emergencies that are coming our way, what other challenges are cities, what other challenges should cities and regions be braced for?
So I want to thank you for the question. I want to extend from something that Mayor Landrieu spoke about, and even your question, and maybe elaborate on it from my perspective a little bit more. I do think it is interesting, right, that to the trend line that Mayor Landrieu was speaking about around the reemergence of cities that we've seen over the last number of years, if not the last decade, and the importance of metro areas for what they contribute to the GDP and who they are as economic engines around the world. And we definitely, and I definitely saw that in our own leadership around the world in the Obama administration, where there was an increasing focus on cities. And then we have these moments. Now, I'll take one step back to say that we have seen the benefits from our cities of density, what it means to be proximate to each other, what it means to actually have talent together, what it means to be creative hubs of innovation, the arts, and creating a sense of home that cities, again, have been hallmarks of. When COVID hits, and you asked this question, so then in a very interesting way around what we saw for the people, for the moment, who assessed risk for themselves and possessed the choice that they could leave. Mm-hmm. We saw those stories and those trend lines of folks who decided for themselves that they could leave. And then there were those folks who, by virtue of their status, their emergency worker status, who they are as essential folks in the economy, who could not leave. And some might say we're trapped. That dynamic always is with us, right? Choice that's available to folks to exercise choice for themselves and their families, and they are able to leave, and those who will stay. For cities, I am much like Mayor Landrieu on the side of this overall trend that we see of the spaces and places of cities continuing to be the engine that's going to drive growth in the future. I don't think that is at the expense of suburbs and rural, because I see those as inextricably connected to each other. And we see an economy that essentially functions where there's inextricable connections. But I'll say a couple of things here that I think we should pay attention to, and again, we'll return to, which is we, in the United States and around the world, we also see where with COVID that required social distance, with COVID that required separation and isolation, and falling upon a trend where we are segregating and resegregating in the United States, where we have incredible spatial inequality of differences in neighborhoods and zip codes around the United States. That we have, again, a COVID that is pulling us apart, and will our desire, and I think we see some images as we reemerge from this, will our desire to get back together again be strong enough to move against those trend lines, right? That people will not only want to reconnect with friends and family, but actually, to Mayor Landrieu's point, do the hard work of bridging to the tough issues that we have yet to address in the United States. My hope is that our desire from our deep set of separation and isolation will say, maybe this will be the time to address the things that have always been with us, and we will bridge across.
Great. And that gets me to people in the audience listening in. I have a question from Marguerite and Piera, which I'm going to direct to Mayor Landrieu first, but I'll go to you, Salin, as well. Marguerite has asking Mayor Landrieu, how can you put teeth behind legislative action to make sure that cities and localities receive the resources they need. How do you work that from, your point of view in terms of working, having been a public official? How does that actually work? And going to Salin's point, what has COVID-19 taught us? How can we rectify perhaps those things that were fundamentally wrong and that were sort of swept under the rug?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, there are certain things that only the federal government can do. The federal government, for the most part, doesn't have a balanced budget requirement. The federal government, in partnership with the Federal Reserve and other monetary and fiscal entities, have the authority to incur substantial amounts of debt in order to get money down to the ground. They demonstrated that with great speed in phases 1, 2, and 3 of the recovery. It really is a matter of policy, whether or not they believe that states and local governments deserve and in fact need those kinds of resources in order to provide the service that the federal government in partnership should be responsible for delivering. One of the great tragedies of this was watching the federal government basically go to sleep on the need for them to be the ones that acquired PPE, testing, et cetera, and basically created a Hunger Games situation amongst the governors and the mayors across America. I've never seen anything like that in the 30 years that I have been in office, where governors were competing against each other and mayors for a limited amount of PPE that wasn't being produced in the United States. And the consequence, of course, was when you have a lot of people that need a few things, everybody's competing, the price is rising, and only a few people get what's needed and lots of people get left out. That is no way to run a railroad, much less a response to a massive pandemic. So mayors across America have to get together like everybody else and go to Congress and continue to really talk about getting that funding. The second thing is to the much larger baseline inequities, there have to be federal, state, and local responses from a policy point of view if you want to bake it into the law. So making sure that everybody gets paid a living wage ought to be part of our law. Making sure that workplace safety is an essential component of people going back to work ought to be part of the law. Obviously, police community relations need to be dealt with in a very specific and special way, all of those things. But again, Congress is responsible for passing laws on the federal level. The states, the governors and the legislators are, and then on the local level, and I think you see this happening a lot, mayors and city councils are the ones that are putting these things in place. But it is really a matter of choice. This is not going to happen by accident. We are going to have to decide as a country who we are as a people, what kind of community we want to have, how we're going to work with each other. I think, one of the things the virus is teaching us is how much we really need each other, how much we depend on each other, how dependable cities are, restaurants in the cities, to the farmers that are actually making the food, how dependent the businesses are to the folks that are living in the rural areas that are helping manufacture some of the things that they sell. It creates a little bit of a situation where they say, well, if we're going to come back together, we can't come back that closely. I think we're going to figure out a way to adapt to that. And of course, all of this depends on the medical side, us finding a therapeutic and a vaccine to treat this illness. Unless and until that happens, I think we're going to slow walk into the next phase of this. So that's why I'm glad that they're working so hard on that.
Salin, would you like to weigh in on Piero's question about what we've learned from COVID-19 and what can we do better after this is behind us?
Yeah, I'd reiterate and echo some of the same sentiments that Mayor Landrieu actually put on the table. I think he was mentioning around what it means to think about living wage employment. I think that's going to be critical. I think, again, we're exposing at some level the fragility of people, not only to recover for themselves and to have a sense of resilience for themselves and their families, but what everyone actually needs. We actually, in the work that we're doing in numbers of communities around the country, are seeing how fragile people's sense of living is, particularly day to day, how much food they have, how long it will last them, what are the basic essentials that become. So again, I think really continuing to think about what families actually need. And then from a policy perspective, I think we're going to have continued conversations around what does the safety net look like in the United States? What is base level protection that everyone needs? This becomes very clear in a pandemic when you have the level of vulnerability that you do. Mayor Landrieu was talking about this, and again, I would echo, we have always been around the world, we have structures in place that enable some to succeed. We are still, and with E Pluribus Unum, I would suggest that Mayor Landrieu is in pursuit of all. How do we actually deliver for most, if not all, of our people? I think that will continue to be important. I will say the other lesson that emerges out of COVID is, and I'm going to try to do this delicately, if I can, which is to run government requires competence. And you cannot actually wing it, and you cannot actually spin it in lots of ways where data and life experience actually suggest to everyone in plain view that it matters to have experience at every level. And in our toughest moments, I think competence and incompetence become really plain. And I think we've seen, unfortunately, here in the United States, that you cannot learn on the job when you're trying to protect people from a pandemic. You can be a quick learner, but everyone requires urgency and competence in those moments. And I think that's getting into greater relief. And last point I would make for this, we've had this kind of trend line where public sector and public policy can get demonized and politics can get demonized. We can again also see where it matters significantly to have capable and competent public sector leaders at every level. And I think it may end up being that our trend line moving forward is that people are reminded, what does that look like? And what is it going to take for us to elect more of that?
Mayor Landrieu, I'm sure you want to get in on this. You said amen to that. It's true. We don't.
Well, I'll make 2 points. The 2 points writ large that were made is, one, we're not nearly as resilient as we should be. Resilience, from my perspective and experience, is getting yourself into a position where you have a base level of strength so that when something bad happens, that it doesn't hurt you badly, or if it does, you have the ability to stand back up and recover. As a general rule, some of that is about the physical space that you live in. Is the area that you live in a position where it can protect you from natural disasters that might come your way? Climate change comes to mind, and sea level rise and all those things. On an emotional level, it's importantly true, but it's clearly true just in terms of basic health care and income. As a general rule, when a massive disaster hits, you have a very short period of time to try to prepare, protect, to recover, and then to rebuild. All four of those things are necessary. The more resilient a community is before those things happen, the more likely it is to be okay. And of course, what the pandemic is demonstrating to us is that we lack resilience because we lack the underlying stability in healthcare and in income and in physical infrastructure. And so this is not revolutionary. This is not new. This is not the first time in the United States of America anything like this has happened. In 1918, we had a pandemic. Of course, we had the Great Depression in the 30s. As a consequence of those things, the Roosevelt administration and subsequent administrations past that created Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. These are social safety nets that actually give you something to stand on. It's pretty clear that right now in America, we have to revisit what the social safety net looks like so that most people have a minimum level of foundation underneath them to be able to be stronger and to be better when something like this happens. That's number one. Number two, I'm a Democrat. I have a certain philosophy of what I think, the world ought to look like. But I can tell you from 30 years of experience, having served with 5 governors, and as we said earlier, been through more disasters than I want to be through, that the point that was made about competence is maybe the most important. That in peacetime, when we're not going through disasters and we're having an argument about whether government should be big or small, or whether tax cuts for the wealthy actually trickle down or they don't, whether regulations are too much or too little, whether the criminal justice system works, or the kind of basic arguments that you would have in any democracy. But the one thing that is not debatable is that when a catastrophic event hits, that's when the government's primary objective becomes immediate and real. And the most important thing is that you have a person who is competent in that office to make sure that they exercise the extraordinary powers that inure to a president or to a governor or to a mayor in an emergency, which are by law, because all of a sudden you begin to govern by fiat almost, because you can bypass a lot of the general restrictions. That person or that group of people or the people that they hire have to be good at what they do. And unfortunately, we're seeing some examples in the United States where we're seeing great leadership and we're seeing great collaboration. In other situations, you could just weep at how small and how petty it is. It is absolutely clear, though, that in those areas where there is cooperation on the federal, state, and local level, there's horizontal and vertical communication, coordination, collaboration. The result is always better. That is 100% true. It is not debatable. And unfortunately, when that doesn't happen, people get hurt and people die. And it is an essential component. And I think many people in America are going to put competence and experience, they should, at the top of the list before they get to, well, do we agree philosophically on the major issues of the day? And I hope that that's true. The other thing that's going to happen, happens all the time, there's a lot of money going out the door really fast. And if you don't have protections in place, there's a huge amount of graft and corruption and misspending that can go on when people are not doing the right thing for the right reason. And unfortunately, every time these things end, when we go back, we're going to find that, some money went when it wasn't supposed to go. So you have to be honest, you have to be competent, you have to work hard, and you have to understand that there's only one thing that matters when a catastrophic event happens, and that's saving lives first. Everything else is secondary.
Well, I mean, let's hope that pendulum switches and people do have a newfound appreciation for competency in public service. I completely agree with both of your comments, but maybe shifting gears a little bit, Andrew has asked in the Q&A function about, rather than thinking about the essentials that you talked about with regard to the social safety net, if we can rethink cities after this pandemic, what are the things that we can sort of maybe think about implementing, more green spaces, et cetera? How do we make cities more livable after the curve is behind us, when we've passed the curve? Mayor Landrieu, do you want to take that and then we'll shift to Salin?
I'll go quickly. I won't be as long-winded. I thank you. But, cities in any spaces that bring people close together also have to be designed in a way that helps cities breathe. If you talk to most architects, they will brag about how when they were designing things, they designed it so that people would move in a certain direction and vice versa. Over the years, in a lot of cities, a lot of green spaces got paved over with surface parking lots. I'm a big advocate of green spaces in cities. You have, for example, you're seeing in the Bronx right now, people living on top of each other and people in Harlem, and they have nowhere to go and they have no space. Any of those things that can help improve people's quality of life is going to be critically important. Number two, the mayor of New Orleans yesterday raised an issue that many of us have been talking about for a long time, is to say, well, the French Quarter, which is our historic neighborhood, 16 square blocks, has really gotten too busy. What would it look like if it was just with pedestrians and without cars? I think a lot of us who are working from home, who are figuring out how to do this whole Zoom piece, are going, you know what, this isn't half bad. Do you really have to go to the office every day? Which means that the person that's paying for that building is thinking to themselves, wow, do I really need 350,000 square feet of office space? Isn't there a better way that we've learned how to communicate with each other where we can work together, but we might be able to work from a distance? And of course, there are other brilliant people out there who are now being newly creative, given the conditions that we exist. And so I'm expecting to see, I don't know if I'd call them dramatic changes, but I would say meaningful changes in how the physicality of cities actually are designed and worked.
Salin, you want to talk about that as well, and maybe also bring in if there's any experience or lessons learned, when you served in the Obama administration. I'm sure you also had a lot of contact with your international counterparts. Are there anything, from cities in Europe or elsewhere that you'd like to see perhaps implemented in the United States as well?
In fact, so that was exactly where I was going to go, which is that, and I agree with actually Mayor Landrieu. I think our relationship to place and space is going to be fundamentally different, and how we actually link that with affordable housing supply issues. Can we reclaim and repurpose physical spaces to fill needs that actually can only be filled by space and place, right? Where people actually live versus where they work that may require a level of innovation and creativity. So I'll echo what Mayor Landrieu. Among the things that actually animated some of the transatlantic partnerships we had in the Obama administration, which I can imagine from a practice level will continue to be the case, the importance of community engagement and voice and democracy and giving people a chance to actually set claim, frame what they would want to see and the physical manifestations of their aspirations, I think will continue to be. It was one of the hallmarks of the relationship of how people began, both from City Hall and beyond with nonprofit and civil society actors, to actually galvanize community, to both bridge across difference, but in particular also say, how do we actually set a different physical context? What do you want to see as residents of a community and a neighborhood? That's one set of things. There was, and you'll remember the time of this, and I'll echo it, it was one of the more powerful experiences I actually had in the transatlantic leadership and partnership. And that was back in 2015, 2016, part of the conversation that we were having globally and that they were having in the EU and in Germany was around the refugee crisis. And there was quite a bit of conversation that we were having in the United States, and Mayor Landrieu will resonate with this, but also with our German colleagues and our German mayors in particular, is as the refugees come into German cities, what does it mean to create a culture of welcoming? What does it mean to actually integrate newcomers into the landscape? Will we go the way of history and just actually house, and as people said there, ghettoize them? Or is there a way for life to come together across those who are already there and those who are new coming? And I remember actually speaking to hundreds of mayors from the EU and Germany specifically, and honestly had to rework my comments because all of the mayors during this particular week were all speaking to, is this opportunity with the refugees coming, or is this crisis for us? And what I ended up saying to them is, in the United States, as Mayor Landrieu has spoken about, we have always been trying to create and have struggled to create a more inclusive economy and place. And just as Germany is on that journey, actually, we could learn a lot from each other. German cities to the United States cities, as we try to build places that create opportunity for others. So I would say, as there potentially could be the increasing trend of xenophobia and nationalism, how do we actually create the cities where everyone can have a sense of belonging? I think that's a huge opportunity for us transatlantically, and it was back then.
So I want to give Mayor Landrieu the last word, but I have one quick question. If you could answer it quickly, Salin. Megan is asking, and it's kind of related to what you just talked about the International Covenant of Mayors. Is that still a viable forum to talk about sustainability and green cooperation? And then I'm going to give the final word to Mayor Landrieu.
I think it is. I mean, I think in the last part of the administration, there was quite a bit of, it was a different posture and a different orientation. I'll go back not only to sets of values and beliefs that public sector leaders had. We did fundamentally in the Obama administration believe that we had to work with our allies, that we had to strengthen relationships across the world, that a zero-sum proposition of we should benefit at everyone's expense is not a sustainable kind of phenomena. And so we saw the birthing of numbers of networks at every level of mayors working together in these covenant relationships. And I thought they were very powerful. I had the opportunity to work with several of them. I do think it matters to have ministries and countries that actually can be aligned to supporting mayors. And again, to Mayor Landrieu's point, where there is not that daylight, and as he said, incontrovertible fact, when we cooperate and work together in partnership, it does make the work better. And so I say we continue to build into those relationships.
Thanks, Salin. Mayor Landrieu, just one quick comment. There's somebody in the Q&A, Chief of Staff to the Mayor of Liverpool. Tris is saying that, great conversation. A lot of these topics that we've been discussing are echoed in the conversations that she has in Liverpool. What would you like to leave us with, Mayor Landrieu? I mean, especially, I'm struck by what's going on in the United States and how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected African Americans. And having read your book, In the Shadow of Statues, there's still hope, right? I mean, talk to us about what we can learn from this whole
First
experience.
of all, thanks for the question from Liverpool. I've never been there, but I'd love to get there. I want to just make a couple of comments. Salin was talking a little bit about process, as have I, about competence, and process is important. Somebody asked a question about laws. All laws are important, but competence and laws and policy and how we respond, in my opinion, is rooted in a fairly simple idea. And that's recognizing that right now in the world, and this is not unusual, this has happened at other periods in our history, where human beings, some have thought of ourselves as being superior to other human beings. And when we're become afraid and we get scared, we tend to reach out and use our power to hurt other people. That has always created horrible consequences, whether it was the Holocaust or slavery, and there are myriads of examples throughout history across the world. Essentially, how we respond to this is going to depend on how most of us choose to see who we are and what we are, not just in the United States, but all around the world. So for example, the pain and the death that comes from a family member who was struck with COVID stings the same in Wuhan and in Liverpool and in Africa, as it does in the Bronx, in Harlem, in the city of New Orleans, or the rural areas of America. That pain is human. It's not a matter of national identity. We have a worldwide pandemic that's demonstrating to us that we're all human, and we all suffer the same way, and we're all going to survive the same way. I'm almost 60 years old, and the older I get, the less I really understand that I know. I used to think I knew everything when I was young, but the older I get, the more questions I have about life. But one thing I am not questioning anymore, and one thing that I am fairly certain about, is how we're all connected. And we are much, much better together. There is no question, and history has proved this time and time and time again, when we reach out to each other and lift each other up rather than push each other off and try to become superior, we are much, much better when we come together. I have no doubt, and I have 100% hope that we're going to figure out a way out of this, but we can't do it by being Pollyannish. We're at a really juncture where the world is trying to decide whether or not superiority is better than cooperation. I think history has already demonstrated what the answer to that is. The only question is, do we have a will? Mm-hmm. Those of us that are in leadership positions, and when I say leadership, I mean mothers and fathers and coaches and teachers, not just mayors and governors and presidents, to make sure that we as a country and as an international community decide that humankind and community is more important than separation, isolation, and superiority. Once you make that decision, everything else should follow from that, because in the world that we live in a world of plenty, we should not have the level of tragedy, the level of poverty, the level of lack of resilience that we have. And our responses to pandemics like this ought to be much, much better than they have been. So I don't think the world has done really well in this response. I think we ought to acknowledge that. We ought to swear that we will never, ever do it again and get ourselves ready, because this won't be the last pandemic. It won't be the last catastrophic event. We cannot control that. What we can control is how we respond to it. And I think that we ought to prepare ourselves to respond much better than has happened, at least on the institutional level. I'm certainly not talking about the first responders that have done an incredible job of putting themselves in harm's way. But I think the world leadership could have done a much better job in seeing this, responding to it, And now we have a chance to catch back and recover from it better than our initial response. And I'm very hopeful that we're eventually going to get it right.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Salin. Great to meet you. Mayor Landrieu, GMF board member too, I should mention. It's good to have you part of our organization. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for listening in, and we'll return to you very shortly with another COVID update. Have a great afternoon, morning, wherever you are. Bye.
Thank you, Sudha.
Bye.
Thank you, Salin.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Landrieu.